All right, so I'm actually very pleased to introduce our closing keynote speaker, Mr. Livingston Holder. Mr. Holder is a leading executive with 30 years of experience in aerospace systems management, engineering, planning, and operations. He has held many senior positions and is well known in the aerospace industry to commercial companies, NASA, NRO, DARPA, the U.S. Air Force, and various arms of the Department of Defense and national security space community. He also spends a little bit too much time with Jeff Feige, which makes him suspicious, which makes him very interesting. So I'm pleased to welcome our closing keynote, Mr. Livingston Holder.
That was good. That was good. Thank you. Okay. When Jeff asked me to speak, he said, you know, we have a lot of, we have an intersection of people, and the industry is going from, I'll say, the old traditional aerospace firms to a lot of new startups, new ideas, new concepts, and somewhere in there they meet, they mix. So he said, you know, you're old. That's what he said. He said, you're old, and you've been with big companies. You were with the Air Force for a number of years. You were with Boeing for a number of years. You've been on your own in a small company, you know, in a small shop for a number of years. So help us understand, where do you see this going? How does this mashup work? And so I thought about this a bit, and I said, well, Jeff, you're right. I'm old. And I love you too. And I've been extraordinarily fortunate in my career to see a lot of different things. So those of you who remember where you were on September 29th, 1956, raise your hand. 1956. Those of you who were alive at that time, raise your hands. Okay, the population of those who were alive in September of 1956 is relatively small. So in order to get to understand you guys, you know, those who are listening, I have to provide information that has context that predates your birth. So I said, this provides an opportunity. So the first thing I said is, first know your audience. You know, what kind of age swath are we looking at? And you know, ask a critical question. You know, how did we get here? First thing I did was I said, what do I want to call this? And I started thinking about how I think about my life in aerospace and what happens within aerospace. And during one person's lifetime, a lot happens in this industry. So I called the presentation The Arc of a Lifetime. And because there's a topic that I know fairly well, me, my family, I'm going to use myself as I go through time to share with you things that were happening in the world of aeronautics, in the world of space, at the confluence between the two, forces that fought each other, complemented each other, things that created the environment that we have today. So there's a lot of things that were going on. So I asked the question, you know, how did we get here? Let's start way back when. That's Julian Holder. He was born on Barbados. And Julian came to the United States June 18th, 1907. And his ship landed in New York. There was no other way to get here from the island other than by a ship. Seems logical. Next, there was this guy. That's Livingston Holder Sr. That's my dad. He was born May 5th, 1911 in Harlem, born in Harlem City Hospital. And so at the time he started out, no one had flown very far at all. Remember, we had, let's go back in time. This is Blriot, first crossing of the English Channel. This happened a mere 2 years before my father was born. So we were just now pond hopping at the time that he was alive. And you may recall that this happened just 8 years before he was born, 1903, when the Wright brothers took the first heavy-duty aircraft and flew it, albeit a short flight. But that was the first time humans had endeavored to get into the air in a powered system. But let's go back to Lewis. This is his landing. Now, they used very complex technology back then, and what he did is he concluded when he was going to leave France that he was going to follow the path of a ship steaming toward Dover. And he was going to follow that ship as a guide. His wife was on the ship. Good plan. Shortly after he took off, there was nothing but fog. He didn't have instruments. He didn't know how high he was. He wasn't sure what direction he was going. He said he was utterly lost. So he just tried to stay going the same way. And he said, we'll see how this works. Now, he had never seen the landing site. As a matter of fact, they hadn't picked a landing site. A buddy of his was ahead of him, and he said, I'll find a good spot and I'll flag you down from the shore tomorrow. Okay, extraordinary planning, great details. So he breaks out of these clouds, he sees the shore, and there's his buddy with a flag. Hey, I found a spot over here. He says, good, and this is the spot. I wouldn't have picked it. Jeff, you've landed in all kinds, yeah, I've flown with you. So, but the thing I like to look at is look at the car. That is not a Tesla, you know? Look at the dress. I love the hats, the headgear. So things were a little bit loose. We were trying stuff, but why did he do it? Well, it was because there was a prize. The prize had been around for a little while, and that prize had not gotten any traction. And it was offered by a paper, and a Paris paper had criticized them. They said that the Daily Mail prize was nothing but a cheap publicity stunt. And they knew it was a stunt because they knew the achievement could not be accomplished. So can't be done. Y'all are just trying to sell some papers. Well, they upped the prize. I think they went from 500 pounds to 1,000 pounds. And some guys tried, and one guy crashed, as he was horribly overweight on takeoff. But he made it. So motivation was prize, a little bit of fame, and the newspapers wanted to sell some papers. Now, years went by, and I put this one in here because it's particularly interesting because it's the first time that we actually took off from the water. This was a Curtiss NC-4, the flying boat. It was the first thing that crossed the Atlantic in about 19 days. The Curtiss was a vehicle with a large center pontoon, that is a claptrap. Okay, you can get out here and choose one of a couple different providers and get on a float plane and go take a vacation and land in Rosario and walk up to your hotel from the plane, or do vice versa here. We were just trying to figure this stuff out. So this flight across the Atlantic took 19 days. Just a little bit later, in June of 1919, the Vickers Vimy flew across in a day. I mean, dude, he had like 3 months where he was champion of the world, and then this thing comes along. This is a bomber. This is a British bomber. So we went from trying to figure out how to fly to how to use our vehicles of flight in weapons of war. And that's one of the things we did. This guy was the first person to actually cross the Atlantic in a solo-powered flight, the Spirit of St. Louis. And again, it was a prize. In this case, it was the Orteig Prize. And Charles Lindbergh went from an unknown mail carrier to a world-renowned figure. And that notoriety brought him personal tragedy with the kidnapping of his son. Interesting politics ensued, but we did something, again, unique, prize-driven. So prizes, military, there's a little bit of a pattern. Hindenburg, bad news. Trying to land, and we think about this, okay, the Hindenburg was landing in the United States. Were we friendly with Germany at the time? Yes, mostly. But it occurred on May 6, 1937. My dad turned 26 the day before this. So during his lifetime, he's seen people cross the ocean, cross the channel in aviation, take on a different type of air transportation with airships, dirigibles. This probably made a huge change in how we thought about lighter than air ships, and really made a step back from that technology, even though we knew there were other ways safer to do this kind of thing. But these types of visuals, this is one that has sound, and you hear the reporters talking about the humanity of it. These things sear themselves into the consciousness of individuals of the time, individuals that are thinking about aviation, individuals that are in leadership, the public. So these create inflection points, and we drive away or toward things because of some of these inflection points. Now, things are starting to get really exciting in our side of the industry. This is a V2 rocket. The V2 was developed by Nazi Germany as a vengeance weapon. War wasn't going so well. Hitler was kind of on his heels. Had the belief that he could bring the Allies to their knees with something that struck terror in them. He was really more unhappy about the fact that, we had been bombing the German homeland from the air and wanted vengeance. He wanted a way back. And so he started putting enormous resources into this project, which downstream turned out to be beneficial for us. I'm going to read some statistics about the V1. First of all, it became the first man-made object to cross the Kármán line. It got to over 100 kilometers. One flight went straight up, straight down. We didn't even know what that line was, but we sent an object to space, a military system, a military missile system, a vengeance weapon was the first object to actually make it to space. After the war, the German scientists had to figure out what they were going to do. Von Braun and a team of about 100 of his people hid out in the Harz Mountains, and they waited for the U.S., the Allies, to capture them. The other part of the German team was captured by Russia, and so the U.S. guys, the guys captured by the U.S., got moved to the United States in Redstone Arsenal. The Russian guys were, and most of the hardware from this, we got a few good parts, but most of the hardware went to Russia, and V2 production restarted in Russia. They had a good chunk of the team. But this weapon was not without cost. The German V weapons, so I'll read this quote, V1 and V2, cost the equivalent of around $40 billion, that's US in 2015 dollars, which was 50% more than the Manhattan Project that produced the atomic bomb. They were built at a cost of about 100,000 Reichmarks, and I don't have a good equivalent for that, except that it was about the same price for building one fighter aircraft in Germany. So they could build a fighter plane or one of these with that quanta of funding. Now, because this was an extraordinarily difficult project to do, they needed manpower and resources. And those were both bad news. They built 6,048 of these systems. They flew 3,225. They launched that many. I don't have the success and failure rate. One of the things they did in order to make this work is they needed manpower. So they brought in SS General Hans Kammler, and he was known for building concentration camps, including Auschwitz. And he was also known to be an extraordinarily brutal taskmaster, and death was common. By the time they figured out how many people died on the project, they concluded that more people lost their lives in the production of these systems than those who were targeted by the system. So that's a heavy, heavy, heavy price to pay for a weapon system. And it also took a huge toll on Germany as a whole. The V2 consumed critical technologies. In order to distill enough fuel alcohol for one V2 launch, you had to have about 30 tons of potatoes. And this is the time when food supplies in Germany are running thin. So now you're taking your potatoes, you're squeezing them down, turning them to mash, and generating alcohol from the potatoes to put into a rocket rather than in your people's mouths and bellies. So that was a real challenge. Germany was running out of explosives. So they started putting concrete in here, or photos of things that had happened to civilians under the Allied bombing. So this was a tough period of time. It cost Germany a lot, and quite frankly, distracted them with resources pointed toward this system and away from other things that might have been more effective from a military basis. So interesting information about this system. Now, not long after that, the war ended. We started looking at high-speed flight. The Bell X-1 was built. This one has the reaction engines rocket on the back. So now we have a rocket-propelled airplane. Please notice, for all you aerodynamicists, that it does not have swept wings. Why, you might ask? Because we didn't understand that straight wings going at high speeds really created problems. It is not the best way to fly, but that's why it's an X vehicle. It's an experimental vehicle. We were trying to figure out how to make stuff work. And in this case, we were trying to figure out how to fly faster than the speed of sound. We actually crossed the sound barrier October 14th, 1947. My father was now 36. Other things were happening. This is the first commercial jet aircraft. Wow, it's a Comet. It's a British Comet. It went into service and immediately started having problems. They had 3 in-flight breakups in the first year of operation. This is not the advertisement you want for your airline. BOAC really was struggling with this. And de Havilland, who made it, didn't understand metal fatigue. Nobody did. What do you mean we're putting cycles on this thing, going up and down, and it weakens it? We bend a piece of metal, we understood that. But with these thin aluminum hulls, we didn't understand it at all. We didn't understand what the shape of the penetrations did structurally, the windows that we thought were a good idea, structurally to weaken this system. So this system came to an end, and then they developed the Comet 2, 3, and 4 in the following years. This was 1952. And during the time that the British were working on this problem, this happened. ICAT was born. That's me. Okay, September 29th, 1956. Oddly enough, the date I asked you about earlier. So none of these cats that were working on this other stuff knew about me. I didn't know about them. We didn't care. But something was going to happen, something dramatic. 9 days before I was born, September 20th, there was the launch of a rocket, a Jupiter C rocket. The Jupiter C was being developed by Werner von Braun's team out of Peenemünde. So the German team was building a rocket that could actually go to space. Not just go to space, but put something in orbit. Eisenhower was president, and his administration was really dead set against having a German-led team put the first object in space. So what he did is he ordered von Braun, who headed up the Army Ballistic Rocket Command at the time, ordered him not to make any orbital attempts. This vehicle, 9 days before my birthday, before I was born, the upper stage wasn't fueled, put nothing in it. Now, I've also read somewhere in history that it had dummy payload in it, and so it was inert. But one way or another, there was no way the fourth stage was actually going to do its job. If it had been allowed to do its job, and if that fourth stage had worked, the nose cone, nothing very exciting, would have actually gone into orbit. The first object would have orbited just before I was born. Didn't happen. Political decision kind of forced the hand. Well, this is what happened a little bit later. This is a year later in Russia. Now, the Russians have launched Sputnik 1. By the way, I also put Sputnik 2 down here so that, let's see if the laser works, because now the first extraterrestrial flies, the first animal from the planet flies. Also, we have the first death in space. The poor dog was euthanized up there. So Laika actually became the first animal in orbit. So they launched Sputnik 1 and 2 before we could get off the ground. We kept trying. By the way, when you see this on your launch pad, you are not having a good day. This is never a good sight. This is Vanguard. Vanguard was being run by the Naval Research Lab. And their mission was to put something in orbit. They didn't have the expertise of the German team that we had brought over. And so some of the things that they were doing were not patently obvious to them. And so they kept swinging real hard and they kept missing. Now the president is embarrassed. The Russians have flown twice. We're blowing up stuff on the pad. And he turns around and says, von Braun, I want your team to return to the mission of trying to launch something into orbit. They took that Jupiter C, put a spinning upper stage on it, a Geiger counter. Van Allen put the experiment together. And by the way, the reason that you've guys seen video of this and the top part spins, that made it simple because you didn't have to have a guidance system because you had a stabilization system at the top. And so very, very innovative. And that put the Explorer 1 in orbit. We discovered the Van Allen radiation belts. We were now in the race. We were now finally in the race. So we kind of swallowed our pride, went with those that actually had the technology and know-how, and pushed forward. Now, aviation wasn't silent at this time. We were still trying to figure out how do we find out about the territories that we know nothing about. Remember, World War II, Pearl Harbor, huge surprise, gargantuan fleet coming toward Hawaii. How can we not see this? Well, the ocean is huge. We have no ability to survey the ocean in any manner that would give us a productive feedback on whether an attack is coming. We have radar sites posted here and there, but you got to get lucky. The guy at the radar site has to understand what he's seeing. He has to relay it to somebody else. They got to understand what he's talking about. Some of these things occurred, but the understanding part generally broke down. Eisenhower, very, very, very concerned about the surprise attack, said, I want to have an overhead surveillance capability. So the guy standing next to this U-2, Clary Kelly Johnson, in his Skunk Works, he developed a large number of novel, innovative flying machines, including that. NASA was formed. Eisenhower had the feeling that we really should try and separate the military space track from the civil space track. He took the old NACA and converted it into the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and said, you guys go do that aero and space stuff on the civilian side, more or less. Well, right after they were formed in '61, they started working with the Air Force and started working on the X-15 project. So now we'd clearly gone through a series of X-planes, and the X-15's job was to try and fly high and fast, learn what we can. It was our first piloted hypersonic vehicle. Every person that flew this vehicle, except one Navy pilot, was awarded astronaut wings. Now, the Air Force guys got theirs right away because they had all crossed what the Air Force considered the astronaut limit, which was 50 kilometers. The civilians who were flying were awarded their astronaut wings about 35 years later. So who says the government doesn't work quickly? But here's where we learned a lot about that which went into the shuttle. We learned about aerodynamic heating. We learned about control at high altitudes, which kind of means stop working the aero problem and start working the reaction control problem. So it was a huge deal for us to do this. But you see that NASA and the Air Force are gleefully working together on a project. Let's move on. Somewhere on the West Coast, the Air Force is cooking up some other stuff. This is the Corona program. Nobody ever really thought about, can we go to orbit and do polar stuff? Well, if the Earth is spinning this way and you're flying polar, that means you'll fly over all of the Earth pretty regularly. So he said, what if we put a camera on this? Again, this is Eisenhower kind of pushing the, I want to know what's coming. I want to know what's over the horizon. I never want to be surprised again. You know, I want more than just airplanes. I want to know all the time. I want to know right now. So we put a film capsule on the top of this thing, the early Agena underneath it, and launched this bad boy into polar orbits. We were not highly successful with our first few flights. We had things that broke up. We had things that didn't turn on. We had things that re-entered early. There was one launch that had a camera on board that came down in a northern island area. And there was an Ice Station Zebra movie kind of made about it because, you know, there was a great feeling that there might be information on it. Well, we were lucky that this thing, you know, made it that far. But we kept trying, and eventually got this system to work. And that's where I started working, was at Vandenberg Air Force Base on National Reconnaissance Systems. Now, you notice the U-2 is back in the picture. And we got a guy, different outfit on. This guy's styling a new look. He's Francis Gary Powers. And he's notable because he got shot down. So Eisenhower says, I want to know what the Russians are up to. What are the Soviets up to? Fly over and see. Well, our intelligence at the time says, we can fly so high they can't hit us. We weren't so right. So he got shot down, and it became a huge political thing because now they have a trial for him in Russia. It's public, what's going on. They have parts of our vehicle, and it was he was one of the first prisoners exchanged during the Cold War era. So now it looks like we're restricted from flying over the Soviet Union. So we're looking for other options. Then at the same time, we start flying people. Yuri Gagarin. Let's see, his first flight was April 12th, 1961. He became the first human to circle the globe. I was 4 years old. Okay, we went from nothing in orbit to launching people in 4 years. Multiple tracks of activity were happening. Military, civilian, US, Soviet, you know, so there was stuff happening everywhere on the planet. Everybody was motivated by self-defense, you know, because we didn't know what the other guys were doing. Some science in there, reconnaissance, force projection, missile systems. But we were doing lots of different things in parallel paths. And it resulted in the first human being launched. Now, at this time, my folks were just worried about a good life for their kids. They really weren't too worried about you know, what we were doing in space. The challenge for them was, can my kids grow up to have a fair and even-handed environment to live in? My dad worked for a small black insurance company. The reason he worked for that insurance company is because if you're African American, getting insurance was not a slam dunk during the 60s. So small companies, African American companies banded together, did business to help each other out. So their concern was for their children. Meantime, something else is going on. NASA finally gets a human launch. Anybody remember the date on this one? May 5th, 1961. My father turned 50 on that day. So he's gone from just barely crossing the English Channel to I'm 50 years old and people are flying over me in space. And so check out the rocket, however. Does that ring any bells? The Redstone rocket? You know, like from the German team that brought you the Jupiter C, that actually put the first, you know, US article in space? So we were starting to use these military systems for civil applications. Again, the large enterprise of the US government is starting to work. The National Reconnaissance Office was formed. This was top secret. The fact that the organization existed was classified, and it remained that way for a long time. We went to the declassification party when we talked about 2 of the satellite systems I worked on, and my wife thought it was kind of entertaining because we couldn't say the words out loud. We had been trained for so many years to not speak these words in public, but only behind closed doors, that every time a speaker came up to say Gambit or Hexagon, which were the 2 programs, they would so they stuttered with this. So we'd been trained pretty well not to even talk about what we did. And like the NSA, which was also classified for a number of years, no such agency, we tended not to talk about what it is we did. But the mission of the NRO was interesting because it was formed for overseeing all satellite and overflight reconnaissance projects, whether overt or covert. Okay, Eisenhower said, we're not going to get surprised. You guys go solve that problem. Now we finally get to the point where US astronauts are being launched on this type, an Atlas. Okay, this is a water balloon that just happens to have liquid oxygen and RP1 in it but its skin is thinner than a dime in most places, so you can actually push on it and pucker it. So this guy's flying on a balloon. And so when you start talking about some of the old heroes like John Glenn, those are heroes because these guys there was no guarantee they were coming back. So, he flew the first 3 orbits, February 20th, 1962, first US astronaut to orbit the Earth. We started putting anything we could on top of rockets to get reconnaissance birds up. Here you see a Corona bird on top of an Agena on top of an Atlas. In the old days, we would stack anything together and just see if it worked. And, we'd do a loads analysis. Charlie, what'd you think? Well, it looks like it ought to work to me, Now, what was really happening is in back rooms in the United States and in back rooms in the Soviet Union, women were doing calculations. The women in both locations were called computers because we didn't have electronic computers to do this work. But because it was tedious, we said, well, women should be able to do that. Well, these women were brilliant, and yes, they were able to do that. They were able to do iterative calculations, long calculations, keep track of complex formulas. But that work for trajectory analysis, loads analysis, things like that complex work was being done by groups of women in both areas, both countries, if you will, USSR and US, and they were both called the same thing. They were called computers. Now we keep moving forward. We're now launching 2 people at a time. This is a Titan. First rocket I worked on was a Titan. Titans were ICBMs, as was the Atlas. The Atlas, I love the name. The Atlas we used to put in what we called coffins, so they'd be lying down. And in the coffin, we would rotate it from the base, raise it from the dead, kind of like the Crypt Keeper, and launch it. And by the way, if your pressure wasn't good, the erection always didn't go well. So, but it was a real interesting challenge. The Titan, structurally stabilized, okay? We didn't need no pressure in a Titan, but we used some nasty propellants. 50-50 blend of hydrazine and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide for the oxidizer. Both of those are carcinogenic, toxic, and will turn your hair gray. So we took these ICBMs out of silos, put them on top, and then put our most revered personnel in the country on top of that. So like I said, we'd stack anything in those days. Again, it looked like high altitude air reconnaissance was being denied. So we said, how about high altitude, high speed? SR-71 was born. Again, another Skunk Works project. By the way, we didn't understand aerodynamics well enough to build this airplane. We really did not. We would do trial and error. We did some wind tunnel. We didn't. The math we based this on was adequate, but these were brilliant individuals. And so if you want to talk about somebody using a slide rule well, that group of cats really did. 1966, this was launched. I was 10. Now we start to transition. We're going to go to the moon. We're going to take these technologies and start pushing them forward. How do we do that? Notice the Saturn V. Notice it's got lots of little tubes at the bottom, kind of reminiscent of Jupiter C and Redstone rockets. like we put them together, strapped them together, and then put something on top and bottom, and said, we can fly this thing. Because that's exactly what we did. So we not only could put stuff on top of each other, we could put it side by side and put it together with a strap and bungee cord and call that a rocket and launch it. But we were starting to do something different. We were starting to put manned capsules and service modules and things like that on top. Finally, we moved to the concept that was different for the US than for Russia, of building a single large engine for propulsion. These are the Saturn V F1 engines. LOX kerosene, pretty simple, gas generator engine. Von Braun, since his time in Germany, had been thinking of what he called the 10-meter rocket. He had analyzed what it would take to get a rocket to the moon as a child and kept working on this problem theoretically. And the base of the vehicle in all of his calculations was always 10 meters. Oddly enough, the base diameter of the Saturn V, 33 feet, about 10 meters. When he told President Kennedy that he was going to build a Saturn V and it was just going to be 5 times more powerful than this rocket, those who were there said Kennedy's impression was he was just going to kind of stack more of these things together. Not true. This is what he really had in mind. And this is what he really had in mind. This, by my standard, is probably the best pure launch vehicle ever designed, built, and flown. It was single purpose, LOX kerosene first stage, very efficient, very fuel dense. LOX hydrogen upper stage, identical engines, 5 J2 engines here, 1 J2 engine on the upper stage. And so we were very efficient with engine production. We didn't build many of these things, but we became very, very efficient. In total, we generated 20 Saturn V launch vehicles. We could have flown 20 missions, but after the 17th mission, too much pressure from Vietnam, too much national strife, and the program was canceled. So this is what was happening when I was 12. So this is the view I had. I said, well, shoot, I'd like to go do that. The problem is, it was a very narrow pathway to get there. You almost always had to be a fighter pilot or somebody like that. After the Apollo program went away, we started Skylab, kind of, started using our segments in different ways. We lost the wing on the launch of Skylab. It tore off, and it had a rough first flight. And the first crew spent a lot of time inside in blistering heat, just trying to make the system work. So they put this sunshade out. There was like a port for a scientific instrument, so we put this thing out and said, okay, now we got a thermal blanket outside. The temperature started to come down. We only had one of the 2 deployable solar arrays, so we lost some power. The telescope package still had all of its solar arrays. It was, so it was a bit of a fixer-upper from the time they moved in. But we flew a number of these, 3 crewed missions. And we started to learn a lot about long time in space. A long time at that time was like 69 days, I think, was the longest crew. In 1974, I was assigned I went to the Air Force Academy, and while I was there, I became an astronautical engineering major. And one of the projects I was assigned by a fellow named Major Walsh, who was a NORAD guy, was to predict where a satellite would be 30 days from the time we had an observation of the satellite. So he gave us 3 points, as L time, as L time, as L time. And so he said, figure out where that thing's going to be in 30 days such that you can see it. So it had to be either early in the morning or late at night, so the sun was still shining in the sky above us, but on the surface, we were in the shadow. So we had the mountains next to us in Colorado. And one of the things we learned is that our calculations were off. I thought I was going to get kicked out, but everybody's calculations were off. The vehicle came over sooner than expected. We learned that Skylab was burning in, and the public didn't know it at the time. So that was kind of an interesting little introduction to the reality of rocket science. Now, also at this point, 1974, the Air Force undertook a project that they hardly ever talk about. And it was one of the most challenging assignments the Air Force had ever been asked to do. They were told to take this guy and turn him into this guy. So, I mean, think about it, really, dude, what do you want me to do with this? He says, make him look like that. Well, 4 years at the academy, studying astronautical engineering, I started to see a transition, a window occur. This happened before I graduated. The first shuttle carrier aircraft separated from the Enterprise. We did landing and approach tests, flying on the back of the shuttle. So the shuttle program was near. So the prospect of actually getting to fly was getting a little bit closer. I graduated, 78, it worked. I started working at Vandenberg Air Force Base. Okay, so we're now launching rockets. We're putting these things in the sky. Again, does this look a little bit ICBM-esque to you? You know, the center cores in both of these are old Titans. You know, so we've done ICBMs, manned launches, reconnaissance satellites. We would use any rocket for anything we could. Very, very efficient about that. And we would just modify it until we couldn't modify it anymore. We put up the GPS constellation. You know, do you guys remember when GPS wasn't? I remember Navstar 7. I was an officer working at Slick 4. I'd been assigned to my colonel's office, and we were going to tell the public, the families of those members who were working on these GPS satellites, what they did because it was an unclassified launch. Going to heaven with Navstar 7. Navstar 7 cleared the fence and crashed in the ravine between the Slick 4 and Slick 3. Lots of trials, tribulations. Could we make the clock stable enough? For the academy, we studied this. And we said the precision of the timing for each satellite, the knowledge of where that satellite is, must be extraordinary. Can we do it? Not at the beginning, but we got really good at it over time. Shuttle started flying. Okay, things are getting exciting. Now, numbers of people flying to space is starting to take an uptick. I see a window. If I can find a path in there, I might be one of the few that get to fly. You know, things kind of lined up pretty good for me. Flights started to become a little more routine. You know, we're launching, we're landing, we're doing well. But I turned into that guy. Okay, that was my MSE photo. And they said, we kind of like this guy. Maybe we should put him in the program. They started training me. You see the smile on my face? I'm happy. Things are going well. I'm starting to fly high-speed airplanes. I wasn't pilot qual, but now all of a sudden I get to fly in these airplanes. So we're starting to spread the number of people who have a shot at flying. Still amongst the military, but we're starting to spread it. I put on my best spacesuit. I'm doing work underwater, and then tragedy happens. The Challenger disaster. So when Challenger went down, and that was, by the way, my vehicle, that was the tail number I was supposed to fly, my life changed personally. But again, this was another one of those global inflection points. What do we as a nation do when our heroes fall? Look at this crew. Compare it to the other crews you've seen. This is starting to look like the United States of America. We have different genders. We have different races, different ethnicities. So we're starting to actually spread how we do work with everyone who wants to be a part of this mission. But what did we do? We soldiered on. We still had a space station to complete. We went forward. We continued working on the space station. We started assessing the risk. We started putting in new flight rules. And we finally got to the point where we had a station that was continuously occupied. Now let's see. The space station, if I've got this right, has been occupied for 17 years, 235 days. Expedition 1 arrived on 2 November 2000. So we've had humans flying in orbit continuously for longer than my grandkids have been alive. And then it happened again. You know, another crew was lost, this time on landing. We'd concentrated so much energy on the launch, we thought we solved that problem. We damaged leading edge carbon-carbon piece, and another group of representatives, not just of the nation, but of the world, were lost. We had people from other nations on board. So we started doing the numbers in greater detail, realized that the system was fragile. It was brilliant. It was some of the best thinking we'd ever done. Extraordinary development, extraordinary technology, extraordinarily difficult, extraordinarily knife edge in terms of forgiveness for faults, and extraordinarily expensive. We were starting to spend more than $1 billion per flight. and putting the lives of 7 crew members at risk with each one of those. We said, this is not sustainable. We must do something different. We developed a plan to retire the shuttle. We then asked our old adversaries, Soviet Union, now just Russia, hey, can we have a ride? You know, we understand that you got some of those Soyuzes around. We got some smaller astronauts. They can fit in that thing. Can we go with you? And so the answer became, da, you know, come on. So we started flying with the Russians. The Russians, we were playing pretty nicely. You know, they were providing rides for us for the crew, supply ships. We were learning about how their technology worked. We were comparing it to U.S. technology. The U.S. was working with the Europeans and the Japanese to make the International Space Station. We joined Mir i Svoboda. That's peace, because our space station used to be called, their space station was called Peace, and Svoboda is freedom, which was the name for our station. So we joined those together and called it the ISS, the International Space Station, and we started a continuous operation of humankind off the planet, at least in orbit around the planet. The DoD did not rest on its laurels. They built the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle program, a LOX hydrogen system, led mostly by the Boeing team, and the LOX kerosene system with Russian engines, the RD-180s. So we've gone to the point where not only are we asking them for a ride, they said, hey, we know you got some engines over there. They look really, really good. Can we put them on the bottom of our rocket and fly? They says, what are you launching? Oh, just stuff, you know? So here we are launching spy satellites, not only to survey the Soviet Union or Russia, but we're using their engines to do it with. I remember I was in a meeting at the Pentagon. I said, this will never work. I said, I don't know what y'all been smoking. Pot was not legal at the time. And I said, I can't even believe, you know, you guys put the proposal on the table. And the Air Force said, well, you know, we had to consider it. And you know, financially, it looked really attractive. And those are some kick-ass engines. And they said after a little while, we'll be able to produce those engines in the US. That never happened. So things change. And administrations change. And our focus changed. And we went from, you know, in a non-adversarial world where the military push isn't driving the new technology, because fundamentally, the technology you have is sufficient for what you need to do. What is it we should do as spacefarers? Should we go back to the moon? It'd been a long time. You know, the 60s was a long time ago. And sometimes an administration would say, yes, let's return to the moon. A new administration would get elected. They say, nope, we've been there, done that. Let's go to Mars. God, do we even remember how to go to the moon? You want us to go to Mars now? Other folks, other voices would come in. They said, nope, let's go to an asteroid. It was like, oh God, now I'm a potato farmer. So we didn't know where we wanted to go. The one thing that had happened before that spurred investment, it spurred direction, was a clear adversary, the threat of war, the threat of nuclear war, the threat of force projection against you, the desire to see what's over the horizon. So all these things created military, civil, but US government and foreign government-driven development. Without the threat being so close, it was much, much harder for us to figure out what direction should we take. So prize money comes back. Prize money comes back, the Ansari X Prize. Can we actually just fly a guy, you know, a few people up and back several times in a week? Can we do that? Can we do that? And aviation entrepreneurs said, yeah, I think we can do that. Part airplane, part rocket. Let's go for it. So we started doing things like that. Work like that became funded by fairly wealthy individuals. And then the commercial industry kind of got tired of waiting. We said, you know, all this technology that you guys held sacrosanct, it was all top secret, we actually know how to do most of that today. Almost everybody knows how to do most of that today. So your secrets really aren't so secret, your secret sauce, but we think we can do it cheaper than you did. So commercial enterprises started taking on on the challenge of launching their own. By the way, the US government was not necessarily pleased by this approach. There was great pushback. The Falcon 1, they wanted to be able to launch off a US base, maybe Vandenberg, and just see if we could get it into a position in the ocean. Leadership in the Air Force said, no, we don't want you even at Vandenberg because you'll put one of my high value assets at risk. You might crash and hit my launch pad and take out something really important. You can go to Kwajalein and launch. If you mess up, there's not much you can hit out there. We created an extraordinary logistics burden for the Falcon 1 system. The crews are going out to these bug-infested islands with, I mean, we take boatloads of locks and just hope it doesn't all boil off by the time it gets there. We made the problem harder for commercial, but they prevailed. And now the launch pad I used to launch off of, you remember that Titan 3B picture that was Slick 4 West? That was my old launch pad. Knock that sucker down. SpaceX has a launch pad there, super clean, ready to go. Says, hey, we can fly off of here now. So the commercial industry started taking a different tack. NASA started taking a different tack with the commercial industry. How about you guys put some money into development? We won't fund it all, but we'll fund a couple of different ideas. We'll fund some cargo ideas. We'll fund some crew ideas. We'll look at things that are non-traditional, like space planes that launch on one of our rockets and comes down at a spot, and maybe it'll even go to the NASA space station. So we started doing these mashups of different ideas. Just, Bigelow, hey, I'm gonna launch a space station. Anybody gonna ride the space station? I'm just gonna do this because I want to. So the commercial space industry, the entrepreneurial space industry, the new frontier, space industry, which largely you guys represent, just got tired of waiting and started doing stuff. The big challenge was funding. But, if you find enough people who are motivated to do something, you can actually make a change. Not everything worked out as planned. Not all new activities work. I put this up here as a kind of a requiem for X-Corps. Simple concept, small rocket, put it behind an airplane. We should be able to do suborbital flights. Should be an enterprise there. Couldn't make it to the finish line. Variety of reasons, but not all enterprises end up successful. Jeff, I put this in for you because guys said, hey, if there are guys flying in these commercial things, we should be able to build spacesuits for them. I've actually worn one of Orbital Outfitters' suits. But there are opportunities. Now companies are saying, well, we'll build our own suits. We'll do different techniques, different technologies. So we've been trying different things. The military keeps an eye on everything that's going on. The Marine Corps said, hey, could you re-enter in a suit from space? And we said, we think so. Why? And they said, well, we have this theory that if you're on site really, really quickly when something happens, that you can prevent it from getting worse. Okay. What would you like us to do? So they started studying this, one war, one ranger type of thing, and guys coming in from orbit. Interesting things. But in the end, we don't know what's going to happen. It's just a lot of things are happening simultaneously. They're happening in different places. There are things happening in parts of the world that none of us in this room know about because whoever is doing that enterprise is keeping it under covers. It's under wraps. So when we ask the question, how did we get here? My answer is, it's complicated. We went from a time when there were no things flying across large bodies of water to a time when things were now flying into orbit to a time when people are permanently occupying space, that's the good occupy space, to a time where our direction is less than perfectly clear. So my thoughts are, concluding thoughts are, the future's uncertain. It's really going to be determined by what you do and how you interact with those things that happen in the world around you. You do not get to control what happens in the world around you. You do, however, get to control, to a certain extent, how you interact with those things. So I would implore you I wish you the best of luck, and please make the most of your arc of your lifetime. We all have a short period of time here on this planet. A lot can happen in one lifetime. Make yours as valuable as you can as you contribute to the future of our space activities in the world. Thank you.